Hi, I'm Larry Puckett, the DCC guy. Well, as the title of the video says, today we're going to look at 6 different ways to improve your DCC performance. So let's get started. Hit that little red subscribe button, and when the little bell comes up, click on it and click all. Okay, let's get started with the first tip. Keep your wheels and your track clean. And this is something I know I've covered in the past at various times. This time it's a very specific recommendation that we're going to take a look at because there's been a lot on the internet over the last year or two on different ways to clean your track. And I'm not going to get caught up in that. We'll go down that route in a future video. In order for your DCC signals to get to the decoder, and to operate your locomotive, they have to have a good, clean electrical path. And if you have a bunch of dirt and grime and oxidation on the top of your rails or on your wheels, that's not going to happen, and your locomotives are going to kick and sputter and run around. So, if you can keep your wheels clean, if you can keep your track clean, you're going to have much, much better performance. Your locomotives are going to run much smoother, and you're going to enjoy it a lot more when you try to operate your trains. Now, a lot of people will say, well, just use keep-alives in all of your locomotives. And that is true. It will help a lot with smoothing out the performance and running of your locomotives. But they have to get power in the first place. So if you get dirty track, they're not going to get good, clean power in the first place. So you still do need to keep your track clean and your wheels clean, even if you do have keep-alives in your locomotive. Now, what do I use as far as cleaning my track? Well, first thing I use right here. This is not a Bright Boy. It's a piece of leftover cork roadbed. And I just use this to clean the top of the rails instead of a Bright Boy. Now, why don't I use a Bright Boy? A Bright Boy is basically just a chunk of rubber with a bunch of grit embedded in it. So you might as well be using sandpaper to clean your rails instead of using a Bright Boy. And I don't recommend either because it will leave scratches in the top of your rails, and that will attract grease and oil, and you'll get a buildup of grime on your track. So, in my opinion, avoid using Bright Boys. Instead, just get some old pieces of cork roadbed and use that instead to buff the top of your rails. It doesn't have any abrasive in it, it just has cork. And that will do a pretty good job of removing a lot of the grime on the top of your rails. Another thing that I do use here on the layout is just a piece of clean, dry cloth, and make it lint-free because you don't want to put lint on your rails. So one thing that's great is an old cotton t-shirt that's been washed to death, and a lot of the lint has been washed out of it. So you can cut that up. As you can see, this is just an old piece of t-shirt, and I use that here on the model railroad a lot for cleaning off the top of my rails. Typically, I don't use any type of organic cleaners. I don't use Goo Gone. I don't use anything but a little bit of isopropyl alcohol if I get a real grungy, dirty spot that I have to go at, or if I'm cleaning up after doing scenery work, things of that nature. So, in spite of all of the stuff you've heard about isopropyl, I think it works very well for cleaning rails. Now, we will talk in a future video about no-oxid and another product called deoxit, but I don't want to go into that one today. Now, another thing that I used, and this is something I did a video on in the past, and I'll put a link to this video above me. Right here, this is a cleaning car. This is an old John Allen design, and all it is a piece of masonite that's been beveled on the end and had 2 pieces of nails glued to it. I've got 2 holes in the bottom of this car, and the nails just fit right in there, and that keeps it moving along with the car. And it just slides along on top of the rails, and it just cleans them up. It just buffs the rails all the time. So if you put a bunch of these in your fleet of cars, then they will just roll along with your train and constantly clean the rails. So take a look at that video and consider. You can use this with N-scale, you can use it with O, you can use it with HO, O-scale, whatever. It works. And it's been in use for, gosh, I think John Allen probably came up with this back in the late 40s, early 1950s. So it's been around for decades, and it works great. Okay, but what about cleaning your car wheels? Because you do need to keep the wheels clean, because if you don't clean your wheels, then they're just, and I'm talking about if you don't clean the wheels on your cars, as well as your locomotives, the grease and grunge and grime that is on those will just be redeposited back on to the head of your rails, and you'll be back where you started. You'll be dirty again, and your performance will degrade. So let's take a look at how you can go about cleaning these. Okay, so how do I go about cleaning the wheels on my cars? Well, there's a couple of different ways. One thing you could do is take a simple cotton swab like this one here and use your favorite cleaning solution. I use isopropyl alcohol. You can use mineral spirits. You can use whatever you want to do it. Some companies like Bachmann make cleaning solutions that you can purchase and use. They're probably just alcohol anyway. But wet the tip of this swab, and then holding one side with your finger, just use it to clean the tread of the wheels. Do that, spin it around, clean it some more, run it around, that kind of thing. That's all it takes. Another thing that you can do is just take a piece of cloth, cotton cloth like this one, and lay it across your rails. Wet it with whatever solution you want. Wet it with isopropyl, wet it with mineral spirits, whatever you want to use to clean your wheels, just do that. Wet it right here, and then put the wheels right on top of it, and then run them back and forth across the cloth like that. And it will be enough so that it will clean those wheel treads. So that's something you want to do. Maybe, check them about once a year. Once your track is pretty clean, you won't find that it tends to build up as much. But that's all it takes to clean them off and keep them clean. Now, you can do the same thing with your locomotives. What I do is take that same piece of rag, put the cleaning solution that I'm going to use on the rag, and then I can set my locomotive on the track so that it can operate. You want it hooked up, of course, to a DCC power supply, and then just hold the locomotive and turn power on. And what will happen is the wheels will spin against the cloth, and that will clean them. It will buff them off because you have the solvent in there. It's going to get rid of some of that grease and grime and take it right off of there. So that's a quick and easy way to do that. And you can see I've used this in the past for that purpose. You can see the dirty lines right there from how I did that. So it's pretty easy. You can, of course, use a cotton swab approach, but it's much harder in this case to turn the wheels and get around the complete diameter of them because they just don't turn like a freewheeling car. Okay, my second tip is to lubricate your axles, your bearings, and your running gear as recommended by the manufacturers. And if you look at the paperwork that came with your locomotives, they will tell you exactly how often you should lubricate your locomotive wheels and gears. They'll tell you what to use, and they'll tell you where to do it. So take a look at those and follow the manufacturer's recommendations. One thing that I do want to pass on to you, and that's my own little mantra for lubrication, and that is the following. Oil is for bearings, grease is for gears. So when you're going to be lubricating a weight-bearing surface or a bearing where two pieces of metal are rubbing against one another, that's where I would apply oil. For gears and things that mesh together like that, then you're going to want to use grease. That's what it's for. And so I have a light oil here. Well, actually, this is a medium weight oil. I think this is probably made by Woodland Scenics. I can't remember which brand it is, and unfortunately the lettering has started to come off of it, so I can't tell you. But get yourself a good hobby lube, one that's plastic compatible. Get it from your hobby shop. Don't buy it from the hardware store because you don't really know what you're getting. The important thing with lubrication is, again, this is great for bearings. So what about for your gears? Well, I like to use this Hobby Lube white grease. It's HL657, and it contains Teflon. And for that, I just smear it onto those gears inside the gear tower and let it run through. And I do that about once a year with my locomotives that are regularly operating. And you can usually just pop the shell off and take a look and see whether or not they still have lubrication on them. I did 2 videos on that, one on diesel and one on steam. I'll put links to those above me or at the end of the video. So go back, take a look at those. Okay, but what about lubricating your rolling stock running gear? Well, what I typically will do with those is I will use a little bit of greaseum or other graphite. You can get graphite at the hardware store. This is KD's own greaseum, number 231, so it's just graphite. And you can just take that and hit a little puff of it down here on these bearing surfaces here, inside of the trucks, or the bogies, as you refer to them in the UK, and that will provide enough lubrication to keep them freewheeling. So every once in a while, take a look at those. If they're starting to slow down and not move freely, then you might want to add a little bit of graphite at the ends of the axles in the bogies or the trucks. Okay, let's go on to tip number 3. That is, buy high-quality decoders. No matter whether you're going to be using them for mobile-only operations or sound decoders, there are a number of high-quality decoders out there made by well-known companies that have been producing decoders for years. And among those, I would suggest looking at decoders from DCC Concepts, Digitrax, ESU Loc Sound, Lens, NCE, Soundtrack, TCS, and Zemo, because those are the ones that I consider the best as far as mobile-only decoders and sound decoders. So among those, I think you'll find that they have been tested quite a lot. They are very good producers. They run very well. They're easy to program in general, and you'll just have fewer problems in the long run with a high-quality decoder made by a firm that has been producing decoders for a number of years. And when it comes to finding support for them, I think you'll find that most of these guys have an online forum somewhere, either on one of the groups at groups.io or maybe on their own websites. So you'll be able to get support from the company itself as well as a large number of other modelers with experience using decoders from these various companies. Okay, the next thing I want to tell you about is a function in CV29, and that is called analog conversion. And I always recommend turn analog conversion off in any decoder when you install it in a locomotive or when you buy a brand new locomotive, because it's probably going to be turned on. Now, what is analog conversion? Well, analog conversion is a function in DCC decoders that allows them to operate on DC power. So if you want to take your locomotive to a club somewhere that still has DC powered layout, then you can use it there. And then you can take it back home and use it on your DCC layout. But I recommend turning that feature off. And the reason for that is when a decoder in a locomotive is hit by a short, and it can be just a little transit short on a layout when somebody goes into a closed turnout or for various other reasons, and they cause a very quick short. And what can happen is that short circuit, flipping on and off, can confuse the decoder and make the decoder think that it is operating on a DC powered layout. And consequently, when it powers back up and it thinks it's on DC, it's going to shunt the full voltage on the track to your motor. So it's going to send, say, 14 volts directly to your motor, and that locomotive is going to take off like a bat out of hell. And it's not going to stop until it hits a curve and derails. It might end up right on the layout. It might end up on the floor. But you don't want that to happen. So you can simply turn it off in CV29. Now this is a table here of values of CV29. And I will tell you, you can download a manual from the Digitrax website, their decoder manual. It has this table in it. You can also go to my website, and I'll put a link to that in the description to this video. And I have this table right here available where you can download it. And all you have to do is enter one of these values here into CV29. And all you have to do is pick the combination of different operating characteristics that you want. And that is whether or not you want a 2 or a 4-digit address, whether you want normal direction of travel, forward or reverse, whether you're looking at 14 or 28, 128 speed steps, and finally, whether or not analog conversion is on or off. So all you have to do is pick the one you want to use and enter the value over here in the first column into CV29, and that will take care of it. Very simple, easy to do, quick programming step. You can do it with programming on the main or service mode program, whichever way you want to do it, but turn that off. Okay, tip number 4, and that is adjust the speed curves in the decoder to get better slow speed performance, to get better performance when you're running multiple locomotives together. Because, you know, in a lot of cases, yard switchers and things like that, you don't want them to be able to fly down the rails at 60 miles an hour. Something like this UK Class 08 diesel, it had a top speed of 25 to 30 miles an hour. And many of the US locomotives had very slow top speeds. And it's very simple to fix that because you can go in with a 3-step speed curve and adjust CVs 2, CVs 5, and CVs 6, and you can change the operating characteristics of the locomotives. For example, if I wanted to knock this down to about 25 miles an hour, I could put a value of, say, 100 into CV5. And that would reduce the top speed of this locomotive proportionally. So it's going to be reduced considerably. If you left CV2 sitting at 0 and 5 at 100 and 6 at something like half of that, 50, then you would get a linear curve with the top speed somewhere around, 30 miles an hour. So that's one way you can do that. Now, what if you're going to be operating 2 different locomotives together in a consist at the same time? Well, what you do is you use that speed matching process in order to make sure that the 2 locomotives will operate at about the same speed at a given throttle setting. And I did a video on that. I'll put a link to the video above me here so you can go back and look at how you go about doing these 3-point speed curves, both for holding down a locomotive's top speed as well as matching the speeds at which 2 locomotives or 3 or 4 would operate when you're operating them in a multiple unit consist. And I think you'll find it's well worth the time and effort to go about doing that. Another thing that can be very handy, if you have a speed demon in your operating crew, or maybe the grandkids come over, or the kids want to run trains, you can give them a train that has a very low top speed, and that will slow them down and prevent crashes on your model railroad. Okay, finally, tip number 6, and that is avoid using 0-bit stretching to run your DC locomotives on a DCC powered layout. And yes, it is possible to do that, and it's using a process called 0-bit stretching. Now, if you remember anything about DCC power, it's comprised of 0 and 1 bits. And what that means is you have that square wave signal that comes from your command station, and those narrow waves are called the 1 bit, the fat waves are called the 0 bit. And one thing you can do on some command stations, and Digitrax is one of these that allows it, NCE does not. But one thing you can do is by using address 0, you can stretch out the amount of time that that 0 bit is on, and it will provide enough voltage on the track consistently to actually power a DC locomotive. However, you should not use that for more than just testing a new locomotive, because there's 2 reasons. First of all, it can damage the motor if you do it for any long amount of time, because it will cause the motor to heat up due to the frequency of the DCC signal, and the motor can overheat and you can burn out the motor. So don't do it other than just for a quick test. Don't plan on running a DC locomotive on your layout during an operating session, because you could burn the motor out. Now, another reason that you should not do it is by stretching out that 0 bit, it interferes with the normal DCC signal, because while that 0 bit is stretched out, you can't send out other signals. So it's going to interfere with the normal DCC signal process, and your decoder is not going to get commands. So you want to avoid doing that. Just use it when you're testing a new DC locomotive, that you just want to run on the layout for a few minutes and check it and make sure it's running properly before you install a decoder. Well, that's a wrap for today's video. I hope you'll take some of my suggestions to heart for different ways that you can improve your DCC performance on your model railroad. It's all pretty straightforward, easy stuff, except maybe a little bit of the programming with CV29. But I think once you get used to it, it's very easy, something that you'll always do when you set up a new locomotive. I suspect, though, that probably the most difficult thing for you will be working with your speed curves and matching the performance of different locomotives, because that is an iterative process. But if you're going to be operating locomotives of a similar type from the same manufacturer, in most cases, they're going to be running fairly close to one another anyway, so you're just going to be tweaking the decoder performance. So give that a try. Watch the video that I provided a link to, and I think you'll find it something that's probably worth your while. So have a great weekend, have a great week. We'll see you here next week with another video from the DCC Guy. Bye now.